If you've come across this video, it would probably be safe to suggest that you're at least familiar with the life and times of the German soldier, novelist and essayist Ernst Jünger. The man lived a fascinating and eventful life, which lasted for virtually the entirety of the 20th century. The 20th century being commonly thought of by most on either side of the political spectrum as the most destructive epoch in human history up to this point. Jünger was born in March of 1895 and died in February of 1998. So in the 102 years of his life, much was written of the man. He was wounded on the battlefield no less than 14 times, and yet lived as long as he did with many of his faculties still intact until his passing. However, to many people, particularly by modern or liberal-minded standards, he lived a life of infamy, and would best be forgotten, or at least kept somewhat obscure. But today we should ask, is forgetting or neglecting a man like Ernst Jünger a wise choice, or do we do so at our peril? Hence, this video will put forth the suggestion that much can be learned from such a man, not just by virtue of his age and thus apparent wisdom, but by directly reconvening with some of his work, i.e. his actual documented thought, as that's all a book is, the documented thought of, and thus insight into the mind of the author. So without further delay, let's take a journey into the mind of Ernst Jünger, by specifically discussing some of his most seminal works. It could be argued that he was best known for his 1920 memoir, Storm of Steel, a brutal and graphic recount of trench warfare in World War I. Some may say he glorified war in the book, whilst it's perhaps more likely that such a man of his time would say that he was just giving some no-holds-barred insight into what he would deem as the necessary culmination, the necessary outcome of what fellow German thinker and long-term confidant of Jünger, Carl Schmitt, referred to as the friend-enemy dialectic. The harshness of reality suggests that the ultimate expression of that dialectic is war, and that war is the only thing that will occur if and when diplomacy is considered completely untenable. This is something that the modern age has tried to forget or wants to ignore but cannot avoid. However, it is not necessarily the fault of the current day modern individual that he has been induced into cowardice or lulled into a false sense of security. He is merely a product of his comfortable, peaceful and nihilistic time, whilst Jünger was merely a product of his time, a time of extraordinary discomfort, unease and idealism. That's not to say that conditions of comfort, discomfort, nihilism or idealism are permanent, as it would be foolish to suggest such a notion. This is why excessive intellectualism and excessive brutality should be, and often are, both deemed to be examples of ignorance. Now, as interesting as it may be to further discuss such confronting ideas, the purpose of this video is to look more specifically at two of Jünger's other works, namely The Worker, published in 1932, and On Pain, published in 1934. Fundamentally, it is evident that Jünger himself is a distinct example of a traditional German and typical Germanness, highly cultured and romantic thinking, with an elemental propensity for order, honor, and dutiful work. The personification of the Prussian man, inner freedom but outer duty. Perhaps this is best demonstrated by his passion for entomology, the scientific study of insects. Consider the functional characteristics of a worker ant or bee for context. Jünger viewed the archetypal worker or powerful figure of the future as essentially a hybrid of the well-drilled soldier and technologically adept specialized worker, an amalgamation of man and machine, to create machine-like men who carry out repetitive labor in service of the state, no doubt foreshadowing automation. This is especially relevant to the recently introduced yet somewhat contradictory, subjective and rather arbitrary notion of essential and non-essential workers, which ultimately appears possibly subject to change on a whim, but is still dictated by the state. Other recommended reading to align with this book is Oswald Spengler's Man and Technics, Hans Zerer's Man in This World, and perhaps even Christopher Lasch's The Culture of Narcissism, for insight into an antithetical obsession with technology for subjective comfort, rather than the strict objective function that Jünger suggests. Jünger also makes many relevant statements and cultural critiques which are eerily prescient in relation to the current epoch, and indicate similarity between now and when the books were originally published. One cultural critique he delivers that stands out in The Worker is as follows: Our technological world is not a domain of unlimited possibilities. Rather, it is an embryonic character driving towards a very specific kind of maturity. That is why our world resembles a monstrous furnace. We cannot but see that nothing is created here with the aim that it will endure, as we might, for example, admire in the edifices of ancient peoples, or even in the sense in which art seeks to produce a valid idiom of forms. On the contrary, every means bears a provisional workshop character, intended for temporary use. Corresponding to this situation, our landscape appears as a landscape of transition. There is no stability of forms here. All forms are continuously remodeled by a dynamic restlessness. There is no permanence of means. Nothing is constant save the rise of the performance curve, which today throws onto the scrap heap the instruments seemingly unrivaled yesterday. That could be interpreted in two ways, as either an example of the insatiable will to conquer uncharted space of the Faustian, resulting in eventual self-destruction, or it is just a more literal statement pertaining to the wasteful, throwaway, excessive consumerist nature of the modern world. Either way, it is accurate. The Faustian spirit is that of the ambitious explorer or the pioneer, but it is also the spirit of the unhinged utopian dreamer, who is hell-bent on taking us to places we ought not to go, yet will only realize the error of their ways after the fact, if at all, once the world is in flames. So what may have been a shrewd observation in 1932 is now blatant and ubiquitous today. Nothing is built to last nowadays, and very little has character or culture. This is somewhat deliberate to encourage materialism and obsession with capital, as well as a deconstruction of aesthetic art and beauty, characterized by a grossly uninspired uniformity of postmodern architectural absurdities, coupled with dreary monstrosities of glass, steel, and concrete. Art critic John Ruskin once said, "The three manuscripts that define great nations are the book of their deeds, the book of their words, and the book of their art." It is self-evident to those who still maintain objective standards as transcendental that the nations of the West have declined immensely in this aesthetic regard, in no small part due to the loss of connection with religion. With regard to On Pain, aside from Jünger's lifetime of defiant stoicism and the obvious strength of conviction in his words, namely the famous quote, "Tell me your relation to pain and I'll tell you who you are," he makes a series of impressive observations on photography and tabloid media with its 24/7 news cycle and desensitization and detachment from pain, as in the absurdity of the glorification of the spectacle of pain, disaster and destruction, yet the simultaneous aversion to pain and danger in real life. In previous eras, it could be argued that the media didn't glorify death and wasn't as transfixed by it, yet simultaneously people weren't as scared of it, or were at least more willing to take risks in the interest of experiencing life more substantially. For example, minor accidents or injury in recreational activities were typically passed off as just evidence of inexperience, rather than a valid excuse not to do the activity at all just to avoid possible suffering. Even if you think you're doing the right thing in protecting them, by constantly forewarning your child and not allowing them to make their own mistakes, you can, and most likely do, stunt their growth psychologically. You demonstrate your own lack of belief in your child to navigate the world. You demonstrate your own cowardice and shortcomings as an individual and parent, in that you are so unsure of your child's competency because, frankly, perhaps you haven't necessarily done enough to ensure they would be competent, not just with you, but more importantly, without you. And so, in the end, too much coddling restricts self-belief. However, on the contrary, if you do possess a strong sense of self-belief, it can radiate forth to your child through your own words and actions, and it is that which emboldens your child to be heroic on their own journey. Heroism is still valuable, even in an unheroic time such as the present. The hero is raised by the heroic spirit. The coward is raised by the cowardly spirit. Thus, it is reasonable to suggest that a coward gives birth to a coward, unless somewhere along the line one can break the cycle and admirably overcome or manage their own fear through their sheer will to become more heroic. Nowadays, however, people will ritualistically sit at home in leisurely comfort, watching the latest news broadcast of an overseas bombing raid, a violent action movie, or a racing car accident. Consider the media's current obsessive fascination and enthralled daily coverage of COVID-19 with up-to-the-minute analysis and updates, and then juxtapose that with the pervasiveness of the fear of death and danger, complete with the desperate yearning for and submissive veneration of safety, even at the cost of liberty. One is immediately reminded of the prescient Benjamin Franklin quote, "Those who would give up essential liberty for a little temporary safety deserve neither and will lose both." When reading about Jünger's contention that photography desensitizes people to pain, trauma, or chaos, I immediately thought of 1997 and Princess Diana as my first boyhood exposure to this phenomenon. Not only the endless media coverage that followed the event, but the idea that paparazzi, themselves professional photographers, firstly contributed to the accident and then secondly got out and took photos of the car wreck. Now we are living in the world of COVID-19 and are obsessing in the media and public discourse over something we can't even see, if not for technological advances and our total submission to thinking like machines and the tendency to run on algorithm loops. Once again, if it weren't for technology, we would not even know that the virus exists, but simultaneously because of technology, we fear the virus. We fear the virus because we are reminded of our mortality in this irreligious epoch. It's a fascinating conundrum, and Oswald Spengler's suggestion of a coming second religiousness appears to be an answer of sorts. Even if God is dead, and we killed him through rationalism, as Nietzsche proclaimed, it is surely better for man to believe in something as opposed to nothing, even if those values are dead. The affirmation of nothingness begets evil. Meanwhile, Jünger calls our attention to a change within sports that was only in its infancy in his time, the change being from rather uninspiring physiques and respectful amateur competition to athletic gods with win-at-all-cost mentalities who train and compete like finely tuned machines and obsess about breaking records to push the human body to its full extent. For example, obsessing over getting 0.01 of a second faster in the pool or on the track. Once there is the technology available to measure it, the mind will focus upon it, as that may be the difference between winning and losing when you are competing against a finely tuned machine from another country or region to be the best athletic machine in the world at running or swimming or some other fraction of the human experience. If you are a professional athlete, you are practically already at the limit of athletic potential. The difference between the best and worst professional athlete is actually quite minute. By all means, one should aim high in their pursuits, and fair enough, the championship or gold medal is what you want, but it is just a material exclamation point on the heroic journey you've already undertaken to get to the elite level. In many ways, the journey is more impressive than the destination. The destination is just the fulfillment of the life task, but it was the task or journey itself that got you out of bed at 5 a.m. every morning to train. The journey towards the goal and the desire for the gold medal is more powerful, more valuable, and more educational than the medal itself. Look at the many examples of athletes who have fallen from grace or get into trouble if they don't have the life task of competing or a journey to focus on. Look at what can happen to an athlete after their career is finished, often washed up and lost for a period of time before they find something else to strive for. How one handles being deprived of the journey or routine seems to expose whether they have depth or not, exposes just how human or machine-like they really are. Humans are capable of warmth and have depth. Machines are rather cold and shallow. Thus, soldiers are trained in a very mechanical way, like robots, programmed to perform consistent functions. There are certainly things which are necessary to fight for, believe in, and be robotic about. A free-thinking soldier is often a dead one. Step out of line, miscalculate a mission due to a moment of weakness or hubris, and you could put yourself and your fellow soldiers in danger. Jünger's prophetic work, placed in the context of the current day, would suggest that the only humans that remain are those who are outwardly motivated and willing to do one's duty in embracing the full tapestry of life, be it comfortable or not, whilst intrinsically remaining free thinkers. German idealism, in possibly its truest sense. Those who are willing to acknowledge the existence and importance of objectivity and structure to the outer world, but who simultaneously may not subscribe to one idea forever within the inner world of their own mind. As said earlier, there is still things which are necessary to fight for, believe in, and be robotic about, but it is also important to notice and acknowledge when you are being robotic, should you wish to or have the opportunity to change course.